Frostbite accounted for many casualties, and clean clothes were a luxury. On December 4th, in Raskazovka, just outside Moscow, we faced relentless Russian attacks. They attacked in battalion strength despite our artillery fire, resulting in their mass decimation. As we approached Moscow's outskirts, the temperature dropped further, and our vehicles and horses suffered. The Russians, accustomed to such weather, had an advantage. Frostbite became rampant, and many units were reduced to platoon size. On December 5th, with temperatures at 30 degrees below zero, we reached our objective, Peredelkino, by noon. Our feet felt like awkward blocks of ice as we struggled to put one foot in front of the other and keep walking. I found myself wondering if anything could possibly be worth such suffering. The flesh on our faces and ears would freeze if we left it exposed for very long, and we tried to wrap anything around our heads to prevent frostbite. I could not help thinking of Napoleon's army retreating from Moscow. Our fingers froze even in gloves and stuffed into our overcoat pockets. They were so stiff from the cold that they refused to perform any function. We could not have fired our rifles. I could not help wondering if our superiors in Berlin had any idea of what they had sent us into. Such thoughts constituted defeatism, I knew, but that threat seemed of little consequence at the moment. Instead of moving on immediately after reaching Peredelkino, as we normally would have, some of us went into a peasant hut to get warm, because the cold was surely going to kill us if we did not. Oberleutnant Shumin, battery commander of 3rd Battery, and I, along with our forward observation officers and an infantry lieutenant, went into the same hut to try to warm up. We should not have congregated the key officers from 2 artillery batteries in the same spot where we could all have been killed en masse, but the cold was beyond human endurance, and we had to get warm if we were to survive. We were sitting on the stone stove in the middle of the hut, just beginning to thaw out, when we heard the sharp cracks of tank cannons. We had received no warning from our infantry, and we had just got up to investigate when a tank shell crashed through a corner of the hut and exploded. Shrapnel blasted through the room, scattering broken and bleeding bodies, filling the room with smoke, the smell of burned powder, and the astonished cries of wounded soldiers. 2 people were killed instantly. Although he was alive, Schumann's face was covered with blood from a head wound that was obviously very serious, and blood was coming from his arm and neck as well. The blast had knocked me down, and when I tried to get up I fell again. I realized that I had a head wound also, and had lost my sense of balance. Seeing blood on my sleeve, I inspected my arm and discovered that a chunk of flesh about the size of a large coin was missing from the fleshy part of my upper left arm. Further inspection revealed a piece of shrapnel sticking in the metal insignia of my collar, which had obviously spared me a very nasty neck wound. Everyone in the room was dead or wounded. I called for a medic to come and tend to Schumann. Schumann could speak, but he was very seriously wounded. He was a big man, 6'5" and well over 200 pounds. Perhaps he had just been too big a target. The medics applied rough bandages to our wounds. 8 or 10 Russian tanks had been able to slip past our weary infantry unnoticed. We had not seen Russian tanks for some time, and were probably not as alert as we should have been. They had found an area of depression in the terrain that they could slip through undetected. Letting them catch us unawares was a poor performance on our part. If we had not all been so concerned about getting in out of the cold, it would not have happened. Their tanks did not have infantry with them, however, so they just came close enough to the village to shoot into the houses, and then withdrew, because tanks without infantry were very vulnerable. The first time I had been wounded, in France, I had been surprised, but when it happened the second time I just thought, okay, it has happened again, and I am still alive, so I am lucky, and I hope I am just as lucky next time. I knew I had not been permanently maimed. I was glad to be wounded and out of the fighting, and now especially to be out of the horrible Russian winter. We were not dressed for it, equipped for it, or ready for it in any way. The medics administered first aid and applied bandages to the wounded. Schumann and I were put on sleds and pulled back to my battery by hand. I turned command of my battery over to my battery officer, Lieutenant Steinbach, who reported our losses to battalion, including the fact that both battery commanders had been wounded. Lieutenant Jaschke had been only slightly wounded. Schumann and I were then loaded into the back of a truck to be taken to a field hospital in Vyazma. The truck had brought supplies in and was taking wounded out. We were on the outskirts of Moscow, only about 20 kilometers from the Kremlin, and the trip to Vyazma was approximately 120 kilometers. 9 of us were in the bed of the truck, with a driver and a guard up front. Over frozen ground, it was a cold, jolting, painful ride for wounded men, bouncing around in an empty truck bed, but there was no alternative. I tried to make Schumann as comfortable as possible. His head and neck wounds were obviously serious, and the jolting of the truck was terribly uncomfortable for him. I folded my blanket and put it under his head for a pillow to keep his head from banging on the metal floor of the truck bed. As uncomfortable and painful as my own wounds were in the bouncing truck bed, Schumann's were much worse. After an interminable 3 or 4 hours, we finally arrived at the field hospital in Vyazma. They redressed our wounds at the field hospital. My arm wound was a clean flesh wound, but my head wound had robbed me of my sense of balance, and I was not able to stand. I was at the field hospital only one night, because the Russians had mounted a major offensive. Many wounded were coming in, and the hospital staff was eager to move people on. By the time I was put aboard an ambulance train to Warsaw the next morning, I already had lice under my bandages, a terrible experience because I could not get to them. Schumann was too seriously wounded to travel, so they kept him at the hospital in Vyazma, where he later died. I had known him since France, so we had been together over a year, a long time in combat. We were not close personal friends, but he had been a good comrade and fellow soldier. As battery commanders in the same battalion, we had shared the same combat in Russia, and we had also fought together in France. At 31, he was old for his rank, because he had been promoted through the ranks instead of attending a military academy, a practice that had begun with the start of the war in 1939. Unfortunately, such people were looked down upon by many officers. Many of them were as good as, or even better than the rest of us as officers, because they had more practical experience, but they were not as educated or as sophisticated. There was even a bad joke about them. They were called vomags, a term composed of the first letters of the expression folk officer with a labourer's face. It was a very degrading expression. Schumann had felt the insult keenly, but he had handled it manfully and showed no resentment or bitterness. He had been a good soldier and a good officer, and now he had given all he had to give for folk and fatherland. We did not know it then, but on December 5th, the day I was wounded, the Russians had thrown hundreds of thousands of fresh, motivated, well-trained and well-equipped Siberian troops against us, and they were now pushing us back, away from Moscow. I was spared the experience of the retreat because I was wounded at the very beginning of it. It is terrible to be wounded during a retreat, because retreating soldiers can rarely take wounded with them. The wounded usually lie where they fall during a retreat, to die of their wounds, freeze to death, or be taken captive by the enemy. I did not yet know that the German army had begun a general retreat. I did not know that our tanks had not been able to capture Kalinin and Tula, north and south of Moscow. I knew only what had happened at my own little part of the front, and nothing had happened there to indicate a general retreat. The tanks that had attacked us did not have infantry, and if you stop a couple of tanks that are not accompanied by infantry, the other tanks retreat. I not only had no idea that anything catastrophic was in the making, but on the contrary I thought the same thing that had happened in the Sudetenland and again in Paris was about to happen the third time. I thought my division would soon be holding a victory parade in front of the Kremlin, and I would miss it again because of being wounded, for the third time. The ambulance train took 2 days to go from Vyazma to Warsaw, a distance of about 800 kilometers. By this time I was able to sit up. The more severely wounded who could not sit were in different cars under the care of medics. We were all utterly thankful to be out of the inferno of combat and the murderous Russian winter. We talked about our experience in Russia, about home, and about the food we were receiving aboard the train, which was considerably better than any we'd had in a long time. We all also could not seem to get enough sleep. It was a very pleasant feeling of tranquility. Sitting in the warmth and comfort of the train and watching the Russian landscape pass, we were impressed anew with the vastness of the area we had covered on foot. We now crossed in 2 days an area it had taken us over 5 painful months to cross on foot. But we had crossed most of it in the summer when it was fairly hospitable, and now it was under a cruel blanket of snow and life-taking cold. We marvelled at the Russians' ability to keep producing new divisions, no matter how many we killed and captured. At Warsaw, we were admitted to a former civilian hospital that was now being operated by the German army. There they cleaned my wounds and redressed them, finally getting rid of the maddening lice that had infested my bandages. We were also finally deloused and would not have to worry about those degrading and devouring creatures again until we returned to the front. It was like a gift from heaven to have a bath and be able to soap ourselves down and get clean. The doctors checked me carefully to make sure that further travel would not be detrimental to my condition. The doctors were always especially concerned about head wounds. I stayed in Warsaw only a few days. I called my parents and Lilo to let them know I had been wounded and would be coming home. The army notified families when a soldier was killed, but not when a soldier was wounded. Because of the constant losses, that was not possible. While I was in the hospital at Warsaw, I learned that the Japanese had attacked the United States at a place called Pearl Harbor. So now it was another world war. I did not realize the significance of the event, however. Even when Hitler declared war on the United States, I did not realize what it would mean for Germany. In school, I had not learned much about the economic and political significance of the United States in the modern world. I just felt that the United States had been helping England and Russia with material aid all along, and that now we would finally be able to strike back at them. Thinking that the United States would be fully occupied with Japan, I did not realize that its entry into the war, with its vast resources, virtually guaranteed that we would have to fight a 2-front war, every German general's most dreaded nightmare because of Germany's experience in the First World War. After Warsaw, I was sent briefly to hospitals in Olmutz and Brno, Czechoslovakia, before being reassigned to the hospital in Leipzig. Although I had to be very careful because of my head wound, I could at least walk by now. I reported to the hospital and then went home that first day. Being at home again after so much combat all across Russia was like being a frightened child in its mother's arms. My mother held me so tightly for so long, I thought she would never let go. I knew it was because of what had happened to Fritz and now my being wounded again. My father was the same way. What was happening to their sons was a great tragedy in their lives. The next day I went with my parents to see Fritz. Seeing him was terrible. He was suffering horribly from the pain, and the hospital staff gave him morphine to ease it. He could talk to us when he was not too drugged by the morphine, but then he was in terrible pain. He could not move, and his body was covered with seeping bed sores. He knew he was going to die, and he grimly accepted his fate. We tried to give him hope, but he was just getting worse and worse. It would have been more merciful if the bullet had killed him cleanly. I went to Lilo's studio when I knew she would be quitting and surprised her there. She squealed with delight and threw her arms around my neck, hugging me in spite of my wounds. It was great to see her again, and to know that she felt the same way about me. My memory of her had not failed. She was as fresh and delightful as I remembered. We fell into our old pattern of meeting at her studio when she got off work, going to dinner and then to a movie, concert, or party. For me, she was a real antidote for the war. Christmas was sad for my family that year. We visited Fritz every day, and he was always happy to see us. Just before Christmas, he was awarded the Iron Cross Second Class and the Wound Badge. He received the Wound Badge in silver because of the severity of his wound. It was normally black for the first wound. Receiving his medals made him proud and happy because they represented the only concrete achievements in his short life. At Christmas, we brought presents to the hospital and went through the motions, but under the circumstances, we could not get into the spirit of the season. I was glad every day that I had Lilo during this convalescent period. Fritz's condition was extremely depressing, and the news from Army Group Centre was not good. I remembered the total confidence with which we had begun the Russian campaign, and realised now how overconfident we had been. We'd had no concept of the vastness of the Soviet Union or the size of her population and resources. Being able to go out to dinner and to a movie or a concert with Lilo in the evenings helped me momentarily put Fritz and the things that I knew were happening with my battery at the front out of my mind. When I was not with her, it all came rushing back to fill the vacuum. The morale of the German population did not seem bad. Until the invasion of France, most of the people felt that Hitler was just getting back what had been taken from Germany at the end of the World War. The campaign in France had been popular because we'd had to pay heavy reparations to France after the war, and because France had declared war on us in 1939. And, of course, the fact that we had won the campaign also made it popular. The German people seemed to be quite happy with the way things had gone early in the war. Even with the invasion of Russia, morale was good when things went well in the beginning. The German population in general saw communism as a social evil because of the reports coming out of Russia prior to the war, reports of mass starvation as government policy, of mass executions of political opponents, and of the brutal forced relocation of millions of peasants. All these things were known in Germany, and of course the propaganda ministry emphasized and magnified them. And of course the population, perhaps cynically, would not have objected to our acquiring the food-producing Ukraine and the oil-producing Caucasus. Since our losses in Russia were becoming more and more severe, however, things were beginning to change. During the quick campaigns in Poland, France, Denmark, Norway, Yugoslavia and Greece, we'd had heavy losses, but our losses ended quickly because the campaigns were short. On the Russian front, our per-day losses in the beginning were lighter, but they never stopped. They continued day after day, week after week, month after month. And as time passed, our casualties kept getting heavier. Our losses were never reported at home, but more and more families had sons who had been killed or badly wounded. Slowly, the people began to get the picture, not from the government, but indirectly from talking to one another. Strangers in a store or in a line waiting to buy bread or milk would talk to each other. What bad happened to my family was not different from what had happened to many others, and now it was becoming apparent to everyone that things were not going well in Russia. Of course, everybody hoped that with a spring offensive things would go well again. We learned how to interpret the news because the propaganda ministry always used the same language to describe the same situations. For example, the use of heroes or heroic always meant we had suffered heavy losses. When we read about the heroes of Tula, we knew we were losing the battle for Tula. But it was only at Moscow that things looked bleak. Army Group North still held Leningrad under siege, and Army Group South was doing fairly well against Russian counterattacks in the Ukraine and the Crimea. When the offensive began again next spring, however, I knew the losses would be much heavier, because then the Russians could put up a much stronger resistance. They were much better motivated now than they had been in the beginning. I did not know yet that the momentum and the initiative had shifted to the Russians. In the beginning, the Russian troops we encountered just ran away for the most part, but the soldiers they sent against us in the vicinity of Moscow were of much better quality. They were determined to save Moscow, and they knew how to fight in the winter better than we did. They were fresh, and we were exhausted. They had new equipment, and ours was worn out. They were motivated, and we were becoming demoralized. I could not avoid the irony of the vaunted German army, so admired by the rest of the world as masters of the battlefield until now, being fought to a standstill by a people whom our government described as subhuman. In January 1942, one was awarded the Sturmabzeichen, the medal for participating in hand-to-hand combat with the infantry. In the spring of 1942, the time had come for me to return to the front. Having been wounded twice already, and having seen hundreds of others killed and badly wounded, I had no illusions about what was in store for me eventually. I was weighted with a sense of impending doom. But there was no other way. I felt that we had to see the fight through to the finish. My parents and Lilo accompanied me to the train station in Leipzig. I dressed for the front in the winter field uniform I had received from my home unit. It was a sad leave-taking. I hugged Lilo longingly, knowing I might never see her again. How much luck could I have? I had taken my leave of Fritz the day before. We both knew it was farewell forever. Although he tried to resist the morphine so he could talk to me, he finally had to ask for it because of the pain. For the few minutes before the morphine stole his mind away, we tried to find something meaningful to say, but the anguish of the moment robbed us both of thought and speech. His eyes filled with tears, and so did mine. I took his hand and held it until his eyes closed in peaceful repose. Then, after one last look, I slipped quietly from the room. He had always been so proud of me and my accomplishments, and now he was going to die before he had any real chance to achieve any of his own. I had left my battery in early December at the outermost suburbs of Moscow, but by spring it had been pushed back to a defence line just east of Smolensk. My battery was in log bunkers in a wooded area. Very little was happening on our front. The main thrust of German offensive operations now was being conducted by Army Group South to try to take the rest of the Ukraine and the Caucasus for food and oil. We would exchange artillery salvos with the Russians occasionally just to annoy each other, but there was no sustained combat at this time. It reminded me of the Sitzkrieg period in 1939 in the Eifel Mountains. During the winter, Army Group Centre was not ready to fight an offensive battle because our men and horses were exhausted and our equipment was worn out, and the Russians apparently did not have the resources to mount another offensive campaign after we had absorbed and blunted their December offensive. They had regrouped, as we had, and were just waiting to see where we would take the offensive. It was spring, and the snow was beginning to melt, ushering in the mud period. Only the Russian farm vehicle called a troika, pulled by 3 little panjay, peasant horse, would move on those roads. Roads had been corduroyed between our battery and the division, so we could get ammunition and supplies to our position, but any major movement by wheeled vehicles was out of the question. Our bunkers had been built the previous fall from fresh-cut logs, and when the thaw started, our area of the front became a virtual swamp. The logs of our bunkers even began to sprout new twigs. I had been back with my battery only a few weeks and had just become readjusted to the routine when I received orders to report to Berlin to attend a special artillery school, something like a general staff school for artillery officers. I caught a ride in an ambulance to the train station in Smolensk, where I boarded a train to Berlin, called home from Berlin to let my family and Lilo know I was out of the danger of serving at the front, and then I reported to the school. The students in the school were all experienced combat battery commanders, Oberleutnants and Hauptmanns. The purpose of the school was to produce operations officers for artillery generals who commanded very large units of artillery. I saw Lilo often during the artillery school. I went to Leipzig, only 175 kilometers away, some weekends, and Lilo came to Berlin on others. We were getting serious enough about each other to talk about marriage, but we did not want to get married while the war was going on. Of course, we had no idea at that time how long the war would last. In May 1942, I received a telegram from my parents. Fritz died this morning. Stop funeral day after tomorrow. Stop, can you come stop? Even though I had been expecting it, and even though it was merciful, it was an emotional blow. I had seen many young men die, and I knew this was the price we had to pay for all the victories, but the personal loss was very keen. It was hard to stand by Fritz's grave and bear the heavy pain of losing my only brother. It was even more difficult for my devastated parents. Before I graduated from this school, The school commander offered to recommend me for another school that would lead to a career dealing with the weapons industry for the German armed forces as a coordinator between the armed forces and the manufacturer's research and development people. It would have been a nice, safe job. I would never have had to go back to the front. It would also have enabled me to get an engineering degree at a university in Berlin at government expense, so I would have been all set after the war. But I turned it down because I hoped to eventually attend the Army's General Staff College, and I felt the only way to achieve that was to be at the front until I was selected. I felt almost certain that taking the safe, easy job I was offered would rule out my consideration for the General Staff College. Attending the General Staff College was extremely important to a career Army officer. Also, I was still young and idealistic. I felt that as a young soldier I should be at the front. I never actually performed in the job this school trained me for. We did not have many such artillery units, and the training was really preparatory to forming them. They wanted to have people trained and ready, but most of us went back to our old units until such time as we were needed for the new units. When I graduated from the Advanced Artillery School, Lilo and I took a short vacation to Lake Constance on the Swiss-German border. We stayed at a hotel that had previously been a monastery. We went swimming and took boat trips on Lake Constance and enjoyed the brief few days we had together. I wore civilian clothes and tried to forget about what was waiting for me when I returned to the front. We tried to live for a few days as though the war did not exist, and the two of us were having a pleasant little vacation in a peacetime world. All too soon, Lilo had to return to her job. After she had gone, I visited my mother, who happened to be vacationing in the Alps at the time, and then I boarded the train to Smolensk and my battery at the front. Although most of the fighting during the summer had been conducted by Army Group South in the Ukraine, the Caucasus, and the Crimea, there had been some fighting at our front near Smolensk. My battery was again in a prepared defence line, although not the same one I had left it in. I arrived just in time to take over my battery for the counter-attack to regain the lost territory. We laid down a barrage of artillery fire in preparation for the attack, and then the infantry moved out. I went with them, accompanying the Point Infantry Company so that in case of a counter-attack, I could call in artillery fire on the counter-attacking Russian infantry. The din and confusion of battle, as well as the racing adrenaline that accompanies it, were all too familiar. As we were moving forward on foot, the Russians opened up on us with mortar fire. When one of the mortars exploded near me, my legs went out from under me. I stayed down because of the continuing mortar fire, and Lieutenant Yashka took over directing our artillery fire. I hugged the earth and listened to the whistle and the hum of bullets, shrapnel, and slivers of metal splitting the air above me. It was a short fight, and when it was over, a corpsman treated my wound. I had been hit in the knee by shrapnel from the mortar. Medics took me first to the regimental dressing station, and then to the division's medical facility. I appeared to have shrapnel lodged under my kneecap. Once again, I had been lucky. I was going home with a wound that was apparently not disabling. I went by ambulance to where I could catch a train, and then to Warsaw, where I stayed only a few days. From there I went to Bad Schandau near Dresden, from where I called home. It was only about 100 kilometers to Leipzig from Dresden, and both my father and Lilo came to visit me. My mother stayed home to take care of the business because she knew I would be home soon. It was October 1942. The doctors x-rayed my knee and verified the existence of shrapnel behind my left kneecap, but they did not want to operate to remove it because the joint would never be the same again if it was operated on, and they felt the shrapnel would not do much harm. They just put my leg in a cast, so I could not move it. After a week in Dresden, I was transferred once more to the hospital in Leipzig, where I stayed until November. Having been wounded the third time, I now received the wound badge in silver. I felt at this point that I had been extremely lucky. Many German soldiers and officers had been in constant combat on the Russian front for a solid year, and even more, without getting to go home. I had been wounded and sent home for convalescent leave twice, and had even been sent home once to go to school. I never had a really extended period of combat at the front the way so many unfortunate people did. Lady Luck had so far kept her eye on me. I saw Lilo almost every day while I was home. As usual, I would meet her when she got off work, and we would go to dinner and then to a movie, a play, the opera, or a concert. We felt that things were too uncertain to make definite plans for the future. We tried not to be too serious or think about anything really serious. Our concern now was just to get movie tickets and to meet friends and to enjoy ourselves. We concentrated on having a good time and tried to forget the war in Russia. Lilo was extremely good for me at this point because she was always so light-hearted and gay, and I needed to laugh and have some pleasure now. I would have to deal with the war again soon enough, but until then we did not want to talk about it or let it spoil the time we had together. Lilo, who was still managing the photographer's studio, made some portraits of me in my dress uniform as an Oberleutnant, with my decorations: Iron Cross First and Second Class, Winter Medal, for the first winter in Russia, Sturmabzeichen, for having been in hand-to-hand combat, and Verwundetenabzeichen, Wound Badge, in silver, for being wounded 3 times. Just as there were shortages of men and equipment at the front, there were shortages of everything at home, especially some food items, meat, coffee, tea, chocolate, and so forth, and things were starting to get worse. Earlier, when the war was going well for us, people had accepted the shortages without grumbling, but now that the war was not going as well, people resented the shortages more. The population seemed to be a little more cowed and dispirited. The Russian campaign was just uncertain at this point. By looking at a map, we could see that the Russians still had a very big country behind the front lines. We had only a little of the western part of the whole country. It was the most important part, the part with most of the industry, but there was still a lot of industry around Moscow that we had not captured, and the Russians had taken much of the industry out and moved it back to the Ural Mountains, well beyond our reach. I knew we had not defeated Russia. I had experienced the fresh Siberian troops myself, and I knew now there was no longer any real hope for a quick end to the war. The situation was becoming depressing, especially with the death of Fritz, and I knew the odds were great that I would die in this war. But I still wanted to see the war through to a successful conclusion, as I think the German population in general did. I visited Brunsbüttelkug, my birthplace, with my mother in November 1942, before returning to my home unit for reassignment to active duty. She showed me where we had lived when I was born. My uncle now owned the business my father had started in Brunsbüttelkug. I still had faint memories of ships passing through the canal and sounding their foghorns at night. It was good for my mother and me to spend a little time alone. After losing Fritz, she had almost clung to me, and I knew she had convinced herself that I would die at the front. Since I had reached the same conclusion, I could not really offer her comfort, but at least we could spend some time together and enjoy each other's company for now. We went into a store one afternoon while we were there. She found a warm wool winter scarf and purchased it. When we were back outside on the sidewalk, she pressed it into my hands. "This is for you," she said, as tears welled into her eyes and she threw her arms around my waist. We stood there clinging to each other until her tears subsided. When I reported to my home unit after my convalescent leave, I learned that someone in the Supreme Command had decided that I should establish a school to train ski troops instead of returning to my old unit. My record from Kriegsschule Potsdam contained a comment that I was a good skier. The army needed a ski school, so someone started combing the files and came up with my name. The winters in Russia required soldiers who could ski cross-country with full equipment, and that is what I was supposed to establish a school to teach. So my next assignment was to look for a good location to start a ski school for the army. I went to the Alps, where there was a good chance of having snow most of the time, and started searching for a site. I was told of a few locations that would be good. I went to each of them and looked things over, making sure there were sufficient places to house the soldiers. I spent a week or 2 in the Alps and then returned to make my report. When I reported back to my home unit, however, I learned that my orders had been changed because Stalingrad was in desperate need of reinforcements. My new orders were to report to General Oberst Paulus's 6th Army at Stalingrad. On December 17, 1942, I packed my things and caught a train for Rostov near Stalingrad, where I was to receive my assignment to a specific unit at Stalingrad. It was basically a supply train with a few passenger cars attached. Such trains to and from the Stalingrad area were standard. I had a layover of a day in Kiev, a beautiful old city that was the capital of the Ukraine. Although it had been damaged in the fighting, it was still functioning as a city, and quite a few Russian civilians were still there. The opera was still active, and I went to a performance that evening. The cast was Russian, although the audience was mostly German. In the train on the way from Kiev to Rostov, I passed the Sea of Azov at night on Christmas Eve. I was in a passenger car attached to a slow supply train with a group of other officers going to Stalingrad. We all knew there was heavy fighting at Stalingrad, and we were going into a dangerous situation. But we had no idea how bad it was, because the real situation was not being reported to the public. The temperature outside was extremely cold, far below zero. Under a bright moon, the frozen Sea of Azov presented the mirage of a desert in the frigid blue darkness of the night. It looked like a surrealistic painting rather than a real geographical place. In my mind's eye, I could imagine 3 wise men on camels being guided across the Sea of Azov by a bright white star in the dark night sky. I was jolted from my reverie by the realization that the seductive beauty of this frozen moonscape represented the same killing cold I had encountered on the frozen steppes outside Moscow. Both were beautiful but merciless killers. I left the window and retreated to the warmth of the passenger car, where I joined my fellow officers in singing Christmas carols. I arrived in Rostov, a very old Russian city that was not quite as large as Kiev, on Christmas Day 1942. Although the city had been damaged by the fighting, it was still in fairly good shape. At the railroad station, I was advised to report to the headquarters of the Fortress Rostov Defense Force. There I reported to the Chief of Staff, Oberst I.G. Heisenberg, a tall and almost gaunt man in his 40s. "I am afraid you will have to stay here for a while," he said, almost sadly. "The Russians have surrounded 6th Army, so vehicles are no longer running between here and there. The only way in now is by air, and weather has grounded all flights except those taking ammunition into Stalingrad and bringing wounded out." "Jawohl, Herr Oberst," I responded. "Until the weather lifts and you can get a flight into Stalingrad, you will help me with some staff work. The commanding general of the Fortress Rostov Defense Force needs a daily summary of the reports transmitted by 6th Army in Stalingrad to Army Group South Headquarters. I do not have the time to do it, and I have no one else to assign to it. I hope you are good at writing reports." Heisenberg assigned me quarters, and I went to work for him in the operations department of the Fortress Rostov Defense Force. Our offices were located in an administrative building that must have been Communist Party headquarters, because it was very elegant and beautifully furnished, something I had not seen in Russia until now. We received all reports from 6th Army to Army Group South, because it was important for the Fortress Rostov staff to know the situation in Stalingrad. The Don River flows through Rostov on its way to the Sea of Azov, and the Volga River flows through Stalingrad. The original plan had been to hold the Don and Volga rivers, which were about 150 kilometers apart, and to create a fortified defense line between them that would protect the Caucasus area from counterattack. The oil from the Caucasus Mountains would then be secure. If we could not take Stalingrad, however, we would have to abandon this plan. Rostov, with its bridges over the Don River, was critical to our withdrawal from the Caucasus area if we could not take Stalingrad, and the situation in Stalingrad looked worse with each passing day. Rostov had been declared a fortress city, a term the government was now using to designate a city from which our forces would not withdraw under any circumstances, because it was the key to the only supply line to the Caucasus area and represented the only avenue of escape for our forces there. Although I did not look forward to going into the hopeless situation at Stalingrad, my orders were to go there. I checked with the airport every day to see if I could get a flight, but the weather remained bad. Finally, on January 1st, 1943, the sky was bright and clear, perfect flying weather. I went to the airport, certain that I would get a flight today, only to be told that a Führerbefehl, an order directly from Hitler, had just arrived from Berlin that no more troops were to be sent to Stalingrad. The government had finally recognized the situation as hopeless, and I had once again received a new lease on life. Since I could not go to Stalingrad, I was added to the Fortress Rostov Defence Force staff on a permanent basis. Apparently, I had worked myself into a job. I settled into my new quarters and new job. Many Russian civilians in Rostov worked for the German army, doing the same jobs for us they had done for the Russians, mostly cleaning and other menial tasks. Among those Russians who worked for us, I met an educated Russian woman who spoke German. I worked very late one evening and became so engrossed in the report I was preparing that I lost track of the time and did not realize how late it was until the cleaning lady appeared in the open doorway of my office. "Excuse me," she said in German. "I did not know anyone was here." "You speak German?" I asked, quite surprised. "Yes," she replied. "I learned it at university." She appeared to be just over 30, a bit on the heavy side, with braided blonde hair, blue eyes, and a quick smile. "Then I assume you were not always a cleaning lady," I said. Every place I went, I had always tried to make contact with the local people, and she seemed to present a good opportunity. "I was a school teacher," she shrugged. "But the schools are no longer functioning. I have to live, so I take what is available." Her name was Olga Malenkov, and I talked to her about what life was like in Russia. Apparently, the communist government involved itself in the most minute aspects of people's lives, and employed so many spies that the Russian people dared not trust anyone, not even members of their own family. The slightest comment that could be interpreted as criticism of the government could get a Russian arrested and sent to a labor camp for years. She certainly had no love for her government, and yet she seemed to be indifferent about whether we or the Russians won the war, which seemed curious to me. "At least the communists are Russians," she said when I asked about it. "I do not believe that German fascism would be better." From several conversations I had with her, I gathered that life in the Soviet Union was terribly grim, even for those who were not rural peasants. Yet she steadfastly refused to believe that outside the Soviet Union people lived any better. The daily reports from the 6th Army to Army Group South detailed the number of our people killed each day, the number wounded, ammunition supplies, food supplies, and weapon supplies. The reports also indicated the positions of our various military units and the type of action they were facing: artillery, tanks, small arms, and so forth. We could see the situation on our maps, and the reports created an extremely grim picture that grew worse with each passing day. It was painfully clear that I would have gone into Stalingrad only to be killed or captured. There was obviously no escape from there at this point. The reports indicated that the supplies of food and ammunition continued to diminish daily as the losses continued to mount. The 6th Army finally reached a point it could not even get its wounded out any longer. Hitler's order to stand and fight to the last man, rather than retreat and regroup, was obviously going to have very tragic consequences. Since these reports went all the way up to Hitler, they had to be worded very carefully. They never said the situation was hopeless, because that would bring charges of defeatism against the responsible officer. An officer could not say that everything was lost and he was ready to surrender. He could only report the facts and let them speak for themselves. It had been sheer stupidity to keep our troops in Stalingrad with no way to relieve them instead of permitting them to retreat. But their orders were to stay, and they stayed. And my orders were to join them, and I would have joined them except for the intervention of Providence in the form of bad weather. These remarkably stupid military errors were undoubtedly due to Hitler, a man with no military training or experience above the rank of Gefreiter, taking over the day-to-day operation of the German army. Yet we were supposed to be the master race, according to Dr. Goebbels's propaganda, and the Russians who had the wisdom to let their generals run their army were the subhumans. The irony of it all was becoming painfully obvious. The Russians could have just bypassed the Sixth Army after surrounding it, leaving it to die on the vine, and then marched to Rostov to cut off our escape route from the Caucasus. Later in the war, they would have done that. Now they did not, perhaps because they did not have adequate resources to do it. As part of the staff at Fortress Rostov, I helped plan the withdrawal of our forces from the Caucasus Mountains back into the Ukraine. Our job was to make it possible for the German army to withdraw successfully from the Caucasus before the Russians could take Rostov and cut off the only avenues of retreat. In truth, however, the only reason all our people got out of the Caucasus area when the time came was that the Sea of Azov was firmly frozen and all but the heaviest tanks were able to cross it on the ice. With just 2 or 3 bridges across the Don River, which was about 200 metres wide, it would otherwise have been impossible to get all our troops across the Don in an orderly withdrawal. Helping to draw up all these plans for failure and defeat, in addition to reading the daily reports coming out of Stalingrad, was extremely depressing. We did not know for certain what was happening at the other fronts, because we knew the government did not report defeats, but we knew ours was the major front and we were being defeated. After all our military successes, from the occupation of the Rhineland in 1936 to the march almost to the suburbs of Moscow in 1941, it was a strange and foreboding feeling of helplessness to know that we were on the verge of suffering a defeat of catastrophic proportions. It hurt my pride to see such a fine professional army being wasted by the inept leadership of a man with no military training, knowledge, or experience. The front was still far from Germany, however, and we still hoped perhaps rather forlornly at this point for a change for the better. I was becoming bitter, however, about Hitler's cruel and stupid order to die rather than retreat and regroup, as were many others in the army. I would normally have been at Rostov until all our forces were out of the Caucasus, and Rostov was attacked by the Russians, but Providence intervened once more. One morning in early February 1943, when I went to work, I was told that Oberst Heisenberg wanted to see me. When I reported to him, he returned my salute and smiled, a rare event for him. "Good morning, Hauptmann Knappe," he said. "Congratulations. You have not only been promoted to Hauptmann, but you have also been transferred to France to help form and train a new Sixth Army." I could hardly believe my own ears. Once again I was lucky. I was pulled out of harm's way at the last moment, before the Russians attacked and overran Rostov. I took leave of Oberst Heisenberg and others I had worked with the next day, and boarded the train to return to Germany. Regularly scheduled trains ran between Germany and Rostov, bringing supplies in and taking wounded, furloughed and transferred soldiers out. I was first to report to my home unit at Altenburg. When I reported there on February 17, 1943, I was given an automatic 3-week Eastern Front furlough, even though I had been at Rostov only a few weeks. I went home to Leipzig, arriving just in time to hear the radio announcement preceded by funeral marches of the heroic fight to the last cartridge of our forces at Stalingrad. The government had been forced to announce our defeat at Stalingrad because it was not possible to hide a disaster of that magnitude. We were all becoming bitter now about our government's constant attempt to mislead us and hide the truth from us. Stalingrad was the turning point of the war for us. There had been little Stalingrads before, all of them brought about by Hitler's incredibly stupid orders to stand and fight to the last man, even though it meant the wholesale slaughter of young German men, instead of intelligently retreating to regroup and fight again. Such battles of desperation were becoming more and more frequent. Our casualties were increasing, and the Russian army was beginning to break through our defence lines more frequently. Not only were we suffering more battle casualties, but now many German prisoners were being taken in large numbers by the Russians. A whole German army corps had earlier been encircled and lost, for example, with all its equipment. It had been getting worse for some time, but it was the loss of the Sixth Army at Stalingrad and the withdrawal of Army Group South from the Caucasus Mountains that made it painfully clear to me that we were not going to defeat the Soviet Union. Goebbels's propaganda continued to try to put a good face on things, but after Stalingrad, every thinking person knew we could not win this war against Russia. We had now had to give up capturing the rich food-producing Ukraine and the oil-producing Caucasus, without which we had no chance of defeating the Soviet Union. Even so, we did not even dream at this time that the Russians would ever be able to invade Germany. Our assumption of superiority was still intact even after a defeat of the magnitude of Stalingrad. My furlough was not as pleasant as it could have been because of our defeat at Stalingrad. A black mourning had fallen over Germany. Public dancing was not permitted, so Lilo and I had to limit ourselves to the theatre and concerts. We took a skiing trip to the Austrian Alps, partly to get away from the depressing news and funeral marches that were constantly on the radio. We found the mountain air, the blue sky, and the clean white snow refreshing and invigorating after all the gloomy news of this bitterly bleak time. Lilo and I now decided that we would get married on my next furlough. The war was obviously not going to be a short one, and we decided to wait no longer. On my way to my new assignment in France, I stopped over for a day in Paris once more. I took in the sights of Paris again, but I took the elevator to the top of the Eiffel Tower this time instead of climbing the stairs. The city did not have the same euphoric effect it had had on me in the past. I felt less enthusiastic, perhaps, because I felt older, or perhaps because of our senseless defeat at Stalingrad. Had the experiences at Moscow and Stalingrad aged me that much? At 26, I was certainly young in years. But having seen so much death, and now of defeat, I no longer felt as young as my years, and I found it impossible to respond to Paris as I had in the past. I was posted to a village near the French town of Quimper, in the province of Brittany, where we were to build our new Sixth Army. Quimper was near the Atlantic coast and the Atlantic Wall defence system that guarded against an invasion from England by the Allies. I reported to my new battalion commander, Major Nickish. He had been wounded at Stalingrad and sent home on convalescent leave before the Sixth Army surrendered. He was very serious about the training chore that was ahead of us, because he was sure we would be back in combat in Russia as soon as our new men were adequately trained. My new battery was to be 9th Battery, 3rd Battalion, 194th Regiment, 94th Infantry Division. My new Hauptwachtmeister, Naumann, had already arrived, and he and I set about preparing for the arrival of men and horses. My battery officer, Lieutenant Döstenberg, and my forward observation officer, Lieutenant Uringer, arrived shortly, and the four of us had our hands full as the men, horses, and equipment began arriving. As I was putting this new battery together, thoughts of the old battery I had left in Russia flashed in my mind. Lammers, Bolt with his one eyebrow, our veterinarian, our blacksmith, probably all dead now. How long can anyone live in constant combat? Approximately 10% of our new men were veterans from the old Sixth Army who had been recuperating from wounds or were on furlough when the surrender at Stalingrad occurred. The rest were recruits. Fortunately, Duestenberg, Uringer and Naumann were all experienced combat veterans, which would make my job considerably easier. All four of us were familiar with and prepared for the job ahead of us. We used the Sixth Army veterans to temper and help train the new recruits. Because we expected to return to combat as soon as the new troops were ready, we took our duties very seriously, so we would be assured of leading well-trained troops when we returned to Russia. Our daily and weekly schedule was similar to what it had been at Plauen, as we trained the cannoneers, the fahrers, and the communications people. Our day started at 5 Coz a.m. for the horse people and 6 Gang for the others, as we covered all the things new recruits had to learn. Even the veterans had to repeat it, because they all had to learn how to work together and become a cohesive unit. We could only teach the recruits the mechanics and the skills and hope that the veterans among them could teach them what to expect of combat. In addition to the training, we were expected to man the Atlantic Wall if the Allies invaded from England, so we pushed the training to the limits of the endurance of the men. The Quimper area had been untouched by the war so far. I do not think any military forces had ever been assigned to the area before, so a military presence was something new to the population. At the coast, a short distance away, were the Atlantic Wall fortifications and the German submarine bases at Saint-Nazaire and Lorient. These places had been bombed by the Allies, and the people of Quimper had seen the bombers fly over and heard the bombing, but they had not experienced the brutality of the war directly. I visited the Atlantic Wall and the submarine base at Lorient one weekend. The submarines were housed in bunker-like structures the Navy called pens, and huge balloons were anchored over them to protect them against low-flying aircraft. Enemy aircraft could shoot the balloons down, but in doing so they would have to make themselves extremely vulnerable to ground fire. The Allies bombed the submarine pens many times from high altitude, but they did not do a lot of damage. It would obviously have been a different story if they had been able to bomb from low altitudes. Brittany was a very pretty place, with nice villages. We did our work, training our troops day after day. The local population did not want for anything as far as I could tell. They raised their own food, and they were glad to sell us anything we wanted. Everything seemed quiet at the Western Front, so I asked for a furlough to go home and get married. My request was granted, and our families planned the wedding. In Germany at that time, a celebration took place the evening before, a wedding among the bride's and groom's families and closest friends. The guests, who had all arrived in Leipzig for the wedding, brought old dishes that they would break on the floor for good luck, and the prospective bride would have to clean up the fragments. However, just as I was ready to leave, orders arrived cancelling all furloughs because of an emergency somewhere. The worst of it was that I could not call or send a telegram to tell Lilo, because everything was secret. They went ahead with the wedding eve party without me, correctly assuming that my furlough had been cancelled for military reasons and I could not notify them. 10 days later, the restriction against furloughs was lifted and we scheduled the wedding again. This time, I made it. Lilo was radiant when I arrived home. I had never seen her more beautiful, especially in her wedding gown. We were married first in a civil ceremony and then in a church ceremony. The church ceremony was conducted in the historic Thomas Church in Leipzig, where Martin Luther had preached his first sermon, where the famous composer Richard Wagner was baptized, and where Johann Sebastian Bach had been an organist for 27 years and had written most of his music. Lilo wore a beautiful wedding gown, and I wore my dress uniform, complete with sword. The infantry regiment quartered in Leipzig provided a horse-drawn carriage to take us to and from the church and to a reception in a hotel. We did not go anywhere for a honeymoon because our time was too short. It did not matter because we had what we wanted, each other. All too soon I had to return to my training duties in France. Leaving Lilo now that she was my wife was different from former leave-takings, but at least this time I was not returning immediately to combat. In June 1943, after more than 3 months of intensive training, the larger units of the new 6th Army held manoeuvres in the field, practicing defending against an Allied landing on the beaches. Rommel came to observe these manoeuvres. It was the first time I had seen him since he had been my commander at Kriegsschule Potsdam, and it was the last time I saw him. In July 1943, after the field manoeuvres had ended, I received a 3-week furlough home. Lilo was pregnant with our first child, and I was very eager to see her. She was still radiantly beautiful and happy. Once more we made the rounds of movies, plays, concerts and parties, just trying to have the best time we could in the little time we had together. One night when Lilo and I were at a concert, my mother sent someone to me with a message to return home immediately because my father had had a heart attack. He was dead when I arrived home. He was 58 years old, and he'd had a heart condition for some time. I think my brother Fritz's death hastened my father's. It had hurt him terribly to see Fritz suffer so much every day for 7 endless months, and I think it damaged his health. The emotional scars left by that experience were permanent, and the knowledge that his only remaining son would almost certainly die in this war as well could only have been an additional emotional burden for him to carry. It all caught up with him in July 1943. I had been at Quimper 5 months, from mid-March until mid-August of 1943, when we received orders to move out. The Allies had landed in Sicily on July 10, 1943, and by August the situation there did not look promising for Toulouse. My new division was detached from the 6th Army and ordered to Italy as a precautionary measure. We loaded on trains at Quimper. The process of loading inexperienced, frightened and balky horses aboard trains with mostly inexperienced soldiers was as difficult as ever. We managed to overcome all the problems, however, and travelled from Quimper to Modane, Savoy, on the French-Italian border. We unloaded from the train at Modane and marched to the foot of the Alps, where we camped for the night. I was ordered to report to the tent of my battalion commander, Major Nickish, shortly after dusk. When I arrived, I found the other 2 battery commanders there as well. "We are going to march over the Alps, gentlemen," Nickish said. "The High Command has decided the risk that Italian partisans might have mined the train tunnel through the Alps and could blow it up with one of our trains inside is too great. They think it more prudent to march over the Alps in the open, where we can protect ourselves if necessary." This was going to be a tremendous feat. I returned to my command tent and called in my 2 officers, Lieutenant Destenberg and Lieutenant Uringer. I briefed them on the situation. We were to follow the route Hannibal took across the Alps with his elephants. Our horses had to pull very heavy guns and loaded ammunition carts and wagons. We were to march up to a pass at the crest of Mont Cenis and then down the other side into Italy. The Mont Cenis pass was approximately 2,100 metres high, and the road distance was about 28 kilometres. It was obviously going to be a Herculean task for our horses and for everyone concerned. I was up at 5 a.m. the next day to oversee preparations for the march. We moved out at 6 and began the arduous climb to the pass. We did not ride the horses, of course, or ride on the carts and wagons, but walked and led the horses. We moved on a modern road, but at times we could see the old Roman road Hannibal had taken across the Alps, because it often ran parallel to the road we were on. The horses strained in their harnesses to pull their heavy loads up the mountain. At least the road was paved and the wheels of the vehicles rolled easily. If it had been cross-country terrain, I do not think we would have had a realistic chance of making it. We stopped every 30 minutes for a break instead of every hour as we normally would. The weather was beautiful, with sunshine, clear air and bright skies. The area was also beautiful, with high mountains all around us. But the climb up the steep mountain road pulling their heavy loads was an extremely arduous task for the horses. 9 hours after we started in mid-afternoon, we finally reached the pass and the Italian border. We stopped by a small lake with crystal-clear water, where we fed and watered the horses and gave them 2 hours of rest before we began the descent down the other side of the mountain. We considered it a moral victory just to get all our guns and equipment up to the pass. From the pass, we could see all the way down the other side of the mountain with its winding road, hairpin turns and rushing whitewater creeks. We knew that going down was not going to be an easy task either. It should certainly be easier and faster than the trip up had been, but it would be much more treacherous. For the horses, going down the mountain could be both difficult and dangerous. Although the guns and other vehicles all had brakes, they were primitive brakes that consisted only of blocks of wood that rubbed against the wheels. Not only were they not terribly effective on a steep downhill grade, but they could also wear out quickly. Although the last 2 horses in the 6-horse team could help hold the vehicle back, they would not last long if the whole weight of the vehicle pushed into them, and they had to try to hold it back all by themselves. It was a tension-filled journey down the mountain for all of us, because we knew the danger only too well. By the time we reached the bottom, the trip over the Alps had become by far the most exhausting exercise any of us had ever experienced. We arrived at the bottom well after dark. We pitched our tents near the Italian town of Susa in a meadow surrounded by woods. A creek ran through the meadow, and the farers watered and washed the horses in the creek. My battery had 180 very tired men and 165 exhausted horses that night. It was probably midnight before we were all able to collapse in our tents and virtually pass out. We stayed at Susa all the next day to allow the aching bodies of the men and horses to rest. The men washed their clothes in the creek and wrote letters home. The weather was pleasant, and sleeping in tents was not a real hardship. Meanwhile, trains had been scheduled for the division, and the next day we boarded our train at Susa and went toward Piacenza. We unloaded from the train at Alessandria and marched to Piacenza. The Po River ran through Piacenza, and the bridges across the Po were strategically important because we needed them to get supplies to our forces in southern Italy. Our mission was to ensure that these bridges were secure. Italian soldiers guarded the bridges. We were there as a precaution, in case the Italians deserted us and dropped out of the war. We could not allow them to do that because it would expose all of southern Europe to attack by the Allies. Our advance people had arrived ahead of us, and all units had been assigned housing. My battery was in a village outside Piacenza. For the first few days, we lived in tents, under field conditions. Our forces around Piacenza included one infantry regiment and our artillery battalion. The rest of our division was at other bridges over the Po River. After the first few days, we moved from our tents into permanent quarters. We were issued the khaki uniform worn by Rommel's Africa Corps to replace our field grey uniforms. North Africa had been lost to the Allies, and the uniforms were now to be used in Italy. Piacenza was a picturesque city, a typical medieval Italian city with fortifications. It had been fortified for centuries because of the importance of the bridges. Like most old Italian cities, Piacenza had a lot of archways and a market square in the centre of town where the local people congregated. We had been in the Piacenza area only a couple of weeks when we received orders one evening that the new Italian government planned to make peace with the Allies and join the war against us, and that we were therefore to disarm the Italian army before it could be used against us. We had planned an artillery exercise for the next morning, and my artillery battalion had invited all the officers of the Italian artillery regiment stationed in Piacenza to join us in observing the exercise. We had attended some of their exercises, and this kind of reciprocation was a normal thing. Now, when they arrived to observe our exercises the next morning, we would have to disarm them and detain them as prisoners of war. It was an onerous duty that we did not look forward to. We'd had a very friendly relationship with them, and some of them even wore iron crosses they had won serving under German command in the African campaign. We felt personally that what we had been ordered to do would be an act of betrayal. But we had orders, and we had to carry them out. When their bus arrived with about 30 of them aboard the next morning, we apologetically told them we had been ordered to disarm them and the rest of the Italian army. So we now had most of the officers from their artillery regiment. Our infantry regiment was already in position around Piacenza, and my battery was about a couple of kilometres away. In the meantime, however, the remaining Italian forces had been ordered not to allow us to disarm them, and when our infantry approached them, they opened fire. Our infantry withdrew and asked for artillery support. Then a few Italian armoured cars approached us in a threatening manner, apparently mistaking the pullback of our infantry for a retreat. When our infantry fired on them, the armoured cars turned and fled. It looked as if we would have to take Piacenza by force, in spite of the fact that all the civilian population was still in the city. Because we wanted to avoid civilian casualties if possible, the infantry battalion commander and I decided to fire one salvo of artillery into Piacenza's market square to let them see what the city was going to be subjected to if we had to take it by force. The market square was empty because the civilians knew that combat was likely to occur at any moment, and they were staying indoors. The Italian army had no chance of stopping us if we attacked because they could not use their artillery. It was not in place, and we held most of their artillery officers. I prepared my guns and fired one salvo of 4 artillery shells into the market square. Then we waited. About 20 minutes later, a motorcycle with a senior officer in a sidecar came out, waving a white flag, to surrender the city to us. The artillery salvo had convinced them that it was useless to resist. We confined the Italian troops to their barracks, and our infantry took over security for the bridges over the Po River. It did not go quite as smoothly everywhere as it did in Piacenza. At Genoa and Savona, the Italian navy was in charge of military operations, and it refused to submit peaceably. Those cities had to be taken by force, and there were losses on both sides. Our division took part in the fighting at Genoa, our infantry being moved quickly by trucks. The artillery was to follow, but it was mountainous country, and by the time we got to Genoa with our artillery, the fighting was over. The whole matter of disarming the Italian army lasted only a few days. In Italy, it was not really possible to use horses with artillery because of the mountains and the heat, so I took over the vehicles of a mechanized Italian artillery battery at Piacenza, and for the first time became mechanized. German forces in Italy were now 100% mechanized. In Russia, the figure was about 25%. In France, it was approximately 60%. Becoming mechanized after years as horse-drawn artillery was like assuming a completely different lifestyle. With horses, everyone, even the cannoneers, was affected by the constant attention to horses, feeding, watering, brushing, and otherwise caring for them, whereas we could just park mechanized equipment, turn the key off, and then forget about it until morning. We left our horses with local Italian farmers whom we paid to care for them until they could be returned to Germany. Finally, my dreams of being in the mechanized artillery had come true after 7 years in the army. After the fight at Genoa, we began occupation duty in Italy. Our division assigned individual sectors of occupation to different units. My battery was assigned an area of the Italian Riviera that was about 75 kilometers long. I was to share occupation responsibility for this area with a battalion of motorcycle-mounted cavalry that was commanded by Hauptmann Otto Beloff. Our mission was to guard against a possible Allied landing on the Italian Riviera. The Italians had built artillery into the mountainsides, and I took over their guns in addition to my own. This gave me enough guns for a battalion instead of a battery, although I still had the same number of men to man them. In an artillery duel with Allied battleships, however, we would have been badly outgunned. If the Allies had landed there, we would not have been strong enough to stop them for very long, but the Alps behind us presented them with a natural barrier. All the bridges, passes and tunnels in the Alps had been mined by the Italians, and it was part of our responsibility to blow them up in the event of an Allied landing we could not contain. My area of the Italian Riviera ran from Ventimiglia on the French border to Savona, a naval port, with Imperia falling roughly in the middle. I was responsible for the artillery, and Beloff was responsible for the infantry. I chose Imperia for my headquarters, and Beloff chose another village nearby. I found a beautiful abandoned villa that belonged to a friend of Mussolini's named Faravelli and moved into it. I was told that the owner was staying at another home he owned in the mountains. The villa had about 25 rooms. The bathrooms had both fresh water and seawater, and I could choose which I wanted to bathe in. The villa overlooked the Mediterranean, across a highway and a set of railroad tracks. I lived in the villa with my orderly and a motorcycle runner and had an office nearby. Our stay in Imperia was my most pleasant military duty of the war. Except for becoming familiar with the Italian guns and ammunition, we did not have a lot to do, since we were guarding against a possible but unlikely invasion. The biggest bother would normally have been the horses, and since we did not have to care for them any longer, life was relatively easy. Hauptmann Beloff and I even changed into civilian clothes once, because Monte Carlo was neutral in the war, and drove to the gambling casino at Monte Carlo. From Monaco we went on to Nice and then returned to Imperia. Our pleasant duty at Imperia was all too short. Allied forces landed at Salerno in September 1943, and General Feldmarschall Kesselring, commanding all German armed forces in the Mediterranean area, decided to use our division as part of an in-depth defence line across the boot of Italy, south of Rome, apparently on the assumption that the Allies could not invade Salerno and northern Italy at the same time. We received orders to board trains at 6:30 one morning, and we quickly learned that boarding trains is much easier with mechanised equipment than with horses. We went back through Piacenza and through the suburbs of Rome. The portion of the defence line, called the Gustav Line, assigned to us was north of Naples. 2 other divisions manned the other portion of the defence line. We unloaded from the train at Valerti and marched the last several kilometres, as usual. We went into the prepared line, which was still about 95 kilometres behind the front lines. Our defence line went through the town of Castelfort, but we avoided the town because it would have been such an inviting target and went to the hills south of the town instead. Our first job was to familiarise ourselves with the terrain and the area. We were to be ready and prepared so that if our infantry in the present front line near Naples could no longer hold, it could pull back behind our prepared line. When the Allies came, they would face fresh and rested infantry that was defending an in-depth prepared defence line, supported by artillery familiar with the terrain and all the possible targets in the area. While we held the line, the troops who had withdrawn behind the line would have a chance to rest and become reserve. It is very difficult for retreating troops to stop and turn around and fight again, especially if the opposing troops are pressing hard, as they should always do. So our function was to let our retreating troops through our line, and then to close the line and stop the pursuing enemy there. We were an army corps, with 3 divisions in the defence line and 1 in reserve. Our division had the section of the line that bordered the Tyrrhenian part of the Mediterranean. The division in the middle had the Monte Cassino area, and the 3rd division had the section that bordered on the Adriatic Sea. We were busy every day inspecting the area. The infantry had to look over every little creek and ravine in the area and put down a forward line, complete with trenches and foxholes. I had to establish the possible target areas for artillery support. I went through the area with the infantry and determined how they intended to defend, and then I set up my targets accordingly. We had time to do all this because the fighting was still well south of us. We were in mountainous country, which made it easy to defend, because enemy tanks were almost out of the question. Basically, the only way to attack us was on foot. When we had learned the area and settled into the new defence line, we just waited for the fighting to reach us. The infantry was dug in. Our guns were in an orange grove behind a little ridge, and everything was in place. We could see Mount Vesuvius from our position. The place and the weather were beautiful, and we had all the oranges from the trees in the orange grove we wanted as we waited. The women from the local villages would come to wash clothes in the streams near our position. We thought it would probably be 2 or 3 weeks before the fighting reached us. On November 19, 1943, I received a telegram that Lilo had given birth on November 12th to our son, Klaus Jürgen. The telegram also said that Lilo and the baby had had to flee from Leipzig after a terrible air raid, and that the baby was in a children's hospital in Braunschweig in poor condition. Since things at the front were quiet at the time, I was given a furlough to visit Lilo and the baby. When I left to go home, I took a whole trunk of oranges and a turkey with me, things that were very rare in Germany. When I arrived in Leipzig, I was stunned by the devastation that had been done to the city by an Allied air raid. What a contrast Leipzig presented to undamaged Rome, which I had just left. Since I had to change trains in Leipzig in order to get to Blankenburg, where Lilo was at her uncle's house, I went to my mother's home, changed into civilian clothes, left some of the oranges for her, and went on to Blankenburg, still carrying the remaining oranges and the turkey. When Lilo saw me, she threw herself into my arms and began to sob uncontrollably. Then she told me the whole story of Klaus Jürgen's birth. A few days after Klaus was born at a small private hospital, Leipzig was subjected to the most severe bombing raid it had experienced during the war because of its importance as a rail centre. The Allies dropped incendiary bombs, and large areas of Leipzig were burned. The hospital where Lilo and Klaus were was hit by incendiary bombs and set on fire. Lilo and Klaus stayed in the basement while people tried to put the fire out above them. They succeeded, but there was no longer any water or electricity, not just in the hospital, but in most of Leipzig. With neither water nor electricity, there was no way to sustain life. Lilo could not feed Klaus because there was no milk to be had, and she had an infection that made breastfeeding impossible. It was obvious that she would have to get out of the city immediately, or Klaus would surely die. Her mother suggested that they go to the home of her brother, Lilo's uncle, at Blankenberg in the Harz Mountains. The trip to Blankenberg by train normally took 4 hours, but this trip took more than 24 hours, not only because the bombing raid had disrupted the train service and damaged the tracks, but also because much of the population of Leipzig was evacuating the city. During the whole time, there was no food for Klaus and no beet in the train. When Lilo arrived in Blankenberg, Klaus was an extremely sick baby, and she knew she could not keep him in Blankenberg. He had to go to the nearest hospital in Braunschweig, which was about 60 kilometers away. She got an ambulance and took him to a children's hospital over very dangerous, icy roads. When they arrived at the hospital, a woman doctor examined Klaus. He was almost dead, and the doctor gave him no real chance to survive. He weighed less than he had at birth. Although he did not die, he clung to life for weeks with very little chance of survival. Lilo eventually had to leave Klaus at the hospital and return to Blankenberg. The ordeal she'd had to endure by herself was terrible, and only now did I learn the story. I comforted her, and found myself silently cursing the war that had done this to her and Klaus. We caught a train from Blankenberg to Braunschweig, where Klaus was hospitalized, and there, on January 8, 1944, I first saw my son. He was about 8 weeks old now, but he was still badly underweight and looked terrible. I had never seen a newborn baby before, but all the pictures of babies I had seen were of healthy, fat babies, and he looked incredibly small and sickly. Before I returned to Italy, we were lucky to find Lilo a place to stay. Her uncle in Blankenberg had 3 children, and she did not want to impose upon him any longer than necessary. We found a room for her in a doctor's home. The government required those who had extra rooms to rent them to those who had been bombed out of their homes. Klaus had to stay in the hospital several more weeks after I left, but his life was no longer in danger. He started to recover before I left, although it was quite some time before he looked fat and healthy. I left to return to Italy on January 24, 1944. As I returned through Leipzig and saw the burned-out and destroyed areas of the city, I knew the bombing was beginning to demoralize the population. The propaganda line that the bombing was just drawing people together and hardening their resolve was true because you hate the people who are doing this to you, but the bombing was also having a demoralizing effect, especially on workers who could not get enough sleep or rest because they had to keep going to air raid shelters during the night. They were beginning to just wish this was all over. When my train pulled into the station in Florence and I disembarked, German army officers were in the station directing everyone in a German uniform into a special area of the railroad station. The American army had landed at Anzio. We called this operation the Nettuno Bridgehead, because Nettuno was the main community in the landing zone, and with all our regular infantry divisions tied up at the front against the Allied forces moving north from the Salerno landing area, no troops were readily available to oppose them. So all military returning from furlough or convalescent leave were being collected at the major railroad stations to form makeshift units to try to contain the American forces at Anzio Nettuno until a regular infantry division could be brought in. As an officer, I was directed to go to a nearby hotel for further directions. All officers were interviewed to determine their experience, and I was placed in command of a battalion of 3 companies of makeshift infantry, including Navy and Air Force people who had infantry training. Florence was approximately 370 kilometers from Anzio. We went to Rome by bus, and then loaded aboard trucks for the rest of the trip. Army officers were waiting at Anzio to direct us into a defence line that was already being established. My battalion was assigned a section of the southeast side of the defence line around the landing area. I assigned a sector to each of my company commanders, held some troops in reserve, and waited to see what was going to happen. The defence line we were establishing was about 45 kilometres long in a half-circle around the American bridgehead. We had small arms, but we did not have tanks, artillery, or even machine guns. With inexperienced troops who had never worked together before and who were under strange officers, we would not have been a very effective fighting force at best, and without machine guns, mortars, tanks, or artillery, we would not have much of a chance if the Americans had attacked. But they did not attack. They just dug in. We waited for them to attack, and they apparently waited for reinforcements. It was the quietest battle scene I ever experienced. We saw their ships out at sea, with balloons tethered to the ships to protect them from attack by low-flying aircraft. The two enemy forces just sat and watched each other. A few days later, regular infantry arrived to replace us, and we returned to our own units. I am glad the American commanding general was not Patton, because an aggressive general could have taken Rome with very little effort at that time. Once they allowed us time to get real infantry into position opposite them, however, they had to fight fiercely for every foot of ground. As I approached the Gustav line on my way back to my battery, the fighting was raging near Cassino. About 35 kilometres away, I began to hear the heavy artillery, which sounded like a thunderstorm somewhere in the distance. Then, as I got closer, I began to hear the light artillery as well. Finally, as I got closer still, the sound of battle became the old, familiar, constant roar, with the sounds of mortars and machine guns and rifles in addition to the artillery. Always before, in France and in Russia, this constant roar of battle had been a natural part of my life at the front, and I had thought nothing of it. But this time was strangely different, and I found myself thinking, "Oh God, here we go again, with this constant day-to-day combat." I had never thought or felt that way before, and it never happened again. I had always controlled fear in the past. It may have been because I had just seen Klaus for the first time, had more to live for now than ever before, and was more keenly conscious of my own mortality than ever before. Perhaps it was because I had been out of combat for some time. Or perhaps it was because we were obviously going to lose the war. For whatever reason, returning to the front was extremely unnerving for me this time. When I reported to my battalion commander, Major Nikish, he greeted me with a huge smile. "What would be your greatest desire, Knapper?" he asked. "That this war would be over," I said wearily. "After that?" he prompted. I looked at him. He obviously had news for me. "You have been selected for General Staff training," he said. "Congratulations." I was tremendously pleased and proud, because being selected for General Staff training was the greatest honour a junior officer in the German army could receive. You could not ask for it.